Eliza Orzeszkowa, The Argonauts. Leave a comment if you have an idea for the next book. Chapter 14. Because of his absence of 10 days, Darvid, on his return from the hunting scenes, which had passed noisily and splendidly at Prince Zeno's, rushed into the whirl of business, of labors and visits, which even for him, who was so greatly trained, proved to be wearisome and difficult. He drove out, he received for long hours, both alone and with the assistance of others. He wrote, reckoned, counseled, discussed, concluded contracts, with a multitude of men. Sometimes, in the very short intervals between occupations, in his carriage after a noisy and laborious night, or at the almost sleepless end of it, while putting himself to bed, he thought that in every case the amusement from which he had returned a few days before had cost him more than the worth of it. His life was a belt of toil and duties, so closely woven that every interruption brought to a new point an accumulation of these toils and duties that might surpass even his powers. And what had his object been? Why had he gone? Had he found pleasure in that place? What pleasure? Those full-grown or even old men who found their delight or disappointment in this, that they had hit or had missed a shot. Those great lords, spending their time at a recreation which, by the uproar, the style of conversation, the spectacle of bloodshed, reminded him of the mental and physical condition of wild men, seemed to him children which were sometimes annoying and sometimes ridiculous. Such frivolous amusement, idle, somewhat savage, somewhat nightly, found no access to his brain, which had been occupied so long with the seriousness of dates and figures. He had met there, it is true, though only once, a man in a lyric mood. A youthful person who was riding one day at his side, and who afterward, when they halted, strove to incline him to enthusiasm because of the snow-covered field, the fresh breezes blowing over that field, the deep perspective of the forest, etc. That man was lyric. He confessed openly that the hunting was to him indifferent, that he took part in it not for game but for nature. He loved nature. Yes, Darvid knew that many people loved nature. Art and nature must be powers, since a multitude of men bow down to them. Perhaps he, too, would have done so if the career of his life had led him into their presence, but the path of his life led him in another direction, far from nature and art. Hence he did not know them. He had not had the time. He looked at a field, at snow, at a forest, and he saw a field, snow, a forest, nothing higher, nothing more. He was of those who call a cat, a rogue, and hold every hyperbole, ode, and enthusiasm in silent contempt. He listened to his lyric companion, at first with curiosity, investigating in the man a certain kind of people little known to him. When he had finished, he listened only through politeness and with concealed annoyance. He concealed his annoyance and tried openly to pretend that he shared the enthusiasm, the rapture, and the gladness. He was, of course, in an assembly of very wealthy persons, standing very high. He sailed in a sea of blood purely blue, so he hid away irony, contempt, and yawning, and had on the outside only smoothness itself, affability, and general pleasantness of manner, speech, and smiles. That was also a labor, rewarded at once with a certain degree of lively enjoyment. In lordly drawing-rooms, himself the equal of the highest, while passing the time in a friendly manner and conversing with princes, he was unconscious at first that he raised his smooth, lofty forehead and gave himself out as greater than he was in reality, and inhaled with distended nostrils the odor of that grandeur which surrounded him, as well as that which was his own. But soon this condition yielded to something embarrassing, not quite clearly defined, but causing this, that he did not feel altogether certain of himself and the fitness of his whole self to the surrounding. For though the politeness of those about him was unquestioned and most exquisite, though words of praise and recognition of his services and labor struck his hearing, though his strong feet had under them a foundation carved from gold, he felt strange in that position, involved in phenomena which were new to him, and bristling with difficulties. Sometimes the guests mentioned things of which he was ignorant. They used expressions which were strange to him, and referred to degrees of relationship, and events with which he was unacquainted. He began to stand guard over his own words and movements, with a mysterious fear lest something of his might come out too emphatic or high-colored for the background before which he found himself. In spite of everything which connected the man with that background, he began to feel a broad vacuum between him and it himself. This timidity, a thing entirely new, entirely unknown to Darvid from his earliest years, was an oppression which, during the last days of the hunt, fell on him together with weariness and some third thing, a feeling of the difference between himself and those who surrounded him. Nothing could help him, neither the iron labor which they praised audibly, nor the millions piled up by that labor, millions for which they felt unconcealed reverence. Among those men into whose society he had always desired to enter as an integral part thereof, on that social height to which he had been climbing in imagination and with effort, he felt as if he were in some uneasy chair, put out in a cold wind and deprived of every outlook. He found nothing there on which to rest his eye or his thought. Emptiness, emptiness, weariness, a little humiliation which, like a tiny but venomous worm, was boring into the bottom of his heart. It was not wonderful, therefore, that when he thought of how he had used his time, and of all that he had seen, heard, and passed through, there was on his lips one of those smiles most bristling with pins' points, while in his mind he repeated the expression, wretchedness. He was too wise not to give this name at times to many things of the world which he desired and toward which he was struggling. After some days of labor, so intense that it astonished those who saw it, and which weakened those who assisted in it, he received at an hour before evening, as customary, in his study, all men who came either on business or with visits. He knew no exceptions for anyone, nor indulgence for himself. He received all, conversed with all, for it was impossible to foresee what a given man might contribute, or what he might be good for, if not at the moment, some time, if not much, then a little. But his cheeks seemed thinner than usual, and at moments his speech was less fluent. That hunting trip, and all which he had experienced at it, and afterward, days of activity and unparalleled exertion, were reflected on his face in an expression of suffering. And sometimes even a slight hesitation in speech arose from this, that his mind ran to a subject which tortured him, and raised in his breast a lump of slimy serpents. Some hours before he had inquired of his secretary, who, in spite of youth, zeal, and wit, was bending beneath the burden of labor imposed on him, whether everything was ready for the ball to be given soon, and whether he had received directions from the lady of the house during his, Darvid's, recent absence. The secretary showed great astonishment. How was that? Then the project had not been abandoned. On the morning after the departure of his principal, the secretary sought to come to an understanding with Pani Darvid on this subject, but was able to see only Pana Irene, who declared that he would receive no instructions and that his assistance would not be needed. After that there was silence in the house, undisturbed by preparations of any kind. Then, said Darvid, my wife must be out of health. She has neuralgia frequently. What is to be done? A woman's nerves are a force majeure. But now, while receiving visits and speaking of business, he avoided thinking of the unexpected resistance. How was this? She, the woman for whom the highest favor, the pinnacle of happiness, had been the possibility of remaining at the head of his house, in the brilliancy of wealth and general respect, had the shamelessness to oppose his will. He felt such contempt that, in thought, he threw that woman on the ground to trample her. In spite of this, that, almost unconsciously, he ascribed the blame not to her, but to Irene. Almost unconsciously he saw the tall young lady. She stood before his eyes, cold and distinguished. She, who at the foot of the stairway, in the down of her black fur cloak, with an almost hard glitter in her eyes, under the fantastic hat, had said, "That ball will not be given." That was Irene. The other woman could not have risen to this act. Did he not know her? She had always been so mild and weak, powerless, pitiable. She could not command such energy. It was Irene. With these thoughts he pressed the hand of the last guest, and said to him at the threshold that there was absolute need for the commercial company of which they had been talking to gain a broader foundation of activity by obtaining more and surer sources of credit. Credit, my dear sir. Credit is the first letter in the alphabet of contemporary finance. Send some man to the capital, some man. He hesitated here, thinking, it was Irene. Then he finished, some man with proper authority and weight, best of all that person of whom we have been speaking. Such is my advice. After the last bow of the guest, they closed the door of the anteroom. Darvid turned and saw Irene standing at the round table. That day, while passing on the stairs, when she was returning from a trip to the city, and he was hastening to the carriage waiting for him, they had greeted each other hurriedly and in passing. He had not a moment's time then to talk with her. She, too, was in a hurry, for she ran up the stairs quickly. "Bonjour, père," said she, inclining her head with swift movement. "Bonjour, Irene," answered he, touching his hat. Behind him moved the secretary, carrying a heavy portfolio of papers. After her went some merchant's servant with packages. No greeting was necessary now. Irene, standing at the table, began to speak at once. "I have come, father, to beg you in Mamma's name and my own for a half an hour's conversation, but today, now, absolutely." Her bodice, which was dark and close-fitting, had a very high-standing ruff, which enclosed her slightly elongated and very pale face, just as the half-open shield of a leaf encloses a white flower-bud. Her whole person, in that chamber, with its very high ceiling and massive furniture, seemed smaller and less tall than elsewhere. However, the words "now" and "absolutely" were spoken with such solid emphasis that Darvid halted in the middle of the room and fixed a sharp glance on her. "You have come in your mother's name and your own," said he. "Why this solemnity and decision? You wish, of course, to explain the reasons why your mother and you have seen fit to oppose my will." "No, father," answered she, "but I intend to announce to you Mamma's will and mine." "As to that ball?" asked he quickly. "No, the question is immensely more important than the ball." Both were silent for a moment. If the words exchanged had been less emphatic, and had followed one another less quickly, Darvid and his daughter might perhaps have heard, in a corner of the room, behind a wall of books arranged on highly ornamented shelves, a slight rustle which lasted a short time. Something had moved there, and then stopped moving. "It touches an affair of immensely greater importance than the ball," repeated Irene, "namely, my mother's peace, honor, and conscience." "What pomposity of expression!" exclaimed Darvid, with a slight smile. "I observe more and more that exaggeration is a disease in my family. I should prefer simple speech from you." "The question before us is not a simple one, so I use a style fitted to the subject," answered Irene, and she sat down in one of the armchairs, erect, her hands on her knees, motionless between the wide and heavy arms of the chair. "The subject of which I have to speak with you, father, is much involved and delicate. Do you not share my opinion that one may commit what is commonly called an offense and still possess a noble heart and suffer greatly? In common opinion, this suffering is a just punishment or penance for the offense committed, but I consider this opinion as a painted pot, for everything in this world is so involved, so vain and relative." She spoke with perfect calmness, but at the last words she shrugged her shoulders slightly. Darvid looked at her with dazed eyes. "How is this?" began he, in a low voice. Have you come to talk to me about this? Do you know? Do you understand? And have you come to talk about this?" "My father," answered Irene, "to bring our conversation to any result, we must first of all push away painted pots from between us." "What does that mean?" asked Darvid. "What does it mean? What are painted pots? They are little dabs of wretched clay, but painted in beautiful colors. They are just what naivete, bashfulness, modesty, and darned socks like them would be today in my case." She laughed. "I have known all that has happened this long time. I was a little girl, in a corner of a room, dressing a doll, when a certain conversation between you and Mamma struck my ears, and helped me considerably to understand what took place afterward. Because of business and difficulties which swallowed your time, you were ever absent, father. Oh, I have no thought of criticizing you, no thought whatever. Here a question of logic presents itself, simple logic. You were chasing after that which was your happiness, the delight of your life, while Mamma, poor Mamma, stooped to pick up also for herself a little happiness and delight. But your happiness and delight were open, brilliant, triumphant, while Mamma's were always full of darkness, poison, and shame." For the first time in that conversation her voice quivered, and inclining her face, she brushed away from her dress, with the rosy tips of her fingers, some bit of dust that had dropped on it. Then again she gazed with a look clear and calm at her father, who had sat down in front of her. "To convince you, father," continued she, that our conversation has a perfectly important and definite meaning, I permit myself to open before you the secret, but for me, the visible springs which cause the so-called offense and present disposition of Mamma. It would be better to avoid this and proceed to the point directly, said Darvid, throwing his eyeglasses on his nose with a nervous movement. No, father, permit me to take a few minutes of time, I beg you. This is necessary. Every man has in himself a soul, so-called personal to him, unlike others. She halted for a moment, shrugged her shoulders. For that matter, am I sure of this? The soul may be a painted pot also, but it is the usual name given to our various feelings and inclinations. So pour la comédie de la conversation, I shall use this word. She smiled and continued. There are various souls, some as hard as steel, others soft as wax, some inaccessible to sentiment, others sentimental. Mamma's soul is soft and sentimental. Tenderness, care, confidence are as needful to her as air is to breathing. Do I know, for that matter, the various ingredients which make up the so-called love, attachment, etc.? You, father, have a soul of steel and immensely great business power. We were children. Kara had barely begun to speak then. Well, a moment came. Do I know when? I do not know. But finally that happened which must have happened more than once to you in your very numerous, remote, and prolonged journeys. Do I not speak the truth? In the high plaits of her dark ruff her face was in a blush, but she smiled a little, and with strangely flashing eyes looked directly into the face of her father. For, added she, one would need to have mental rheumatism to believe that you loved only Mamma all the time, and even that you loved her in general. Mamma, of course, did not think that you did. Irene, cried Darvid, but she did not permit interruption. Allow me, I beg you, to say that I am not criticizing. I am not in any sense. There is not a shade of criticism in what I say. I only state and expose facts and causes. That is all. This is requisite. Without this, it would be impossible to understand Mamma's request and mine, which I will tell you quickly. And now I return to the question of the individual soul. That is a thing of capital importance. Offenses, so-called, rise from so-called mean souls or from noble ones. Of the first I know little, but if an offense comes from a noble soul, it is to that soul a great and terrible torment. I have looked at such a torment, and while looking at it, I have been brought to name the so-called love and the so-called happiness painted pots. Idols. There may be idols somewhere, but that which I saw, I assure you, father, did not encourage me to look at things from the idyllic angle. Darvid rose with an impulsive movement. To the question, Irene, to the question. Say what the request is for which you have come, and from what does your mother suffer so greatly? It would be better were you to tell your wish at once, and without these introductions. Do reproaches of conscience trouble your mother? I have no time for psychological analysis, and should like to finish this conversation more quickly. Well, was it that besides conscience and other things like it, she did not find in her lover the man whom her sentiment imagined? I am ashamed to speak with you of this. Tell quickly what your wish is. With a trembling hand he approached the end of his cigarette to the candle burning on the desk. His face, now grown smaller, was contracted from the wrinkles which covered his forehead and the countless quivers which passed across his face. Irene, very pale now, followed her father with her eyes. Her lips were almost blue. Yes, father, answered she. In Mamma's soul that which we call conscience is greatly developed. Moreover, a feeling of shame in presence of us, and humiliation that everything which she has comes from you. At this moment something rustled again, somewhere in a corner, but no one turned attention to it. Darvid, who passed through the room a number of times, hastily stopped again. Speak more quickly, said he. I cannot understand what it is that your mother wishes. I left her in the position of a respected wife, of a mother and mistress of a house. She is surrounded with luxury, she shines in society, and enjoys life. Irene opened her arms with a movement indicating pity. This which you consider as the highest favor for Mamma is just what she does not wish. She does not wish to enjoy the respect of society, which she does not deserve as she thinks, nor to make use of the luxury which comes from you, and which is bound up with speechless contempt. Mamma desires to leave this house, in general, to abandon society life, with all its luxury and brilliancy. I have known for a considerable time of this, and therefore had the plan of marrying soon and withdrawing from here with Mamma. Darvid put an end to his emotion. His daughter's words approached facts, and facts demanded cool blood. If you wish to speak of your intention to marry the Baron, I must tell you. You have no need to speak of that, father. I have abandoned that intention. I had it, but I have dropped it. Another plan entirely different has taken its place. You own a village in a remote province which came to you from your parents. I wish to ask you to give me that village, to endow me with it, but immediately. I suppose I know, even, that it was your intention to give me a dowry 10 times as valuable. Now I am ready to renounce 9/10ths orally, in writing, in every form and every manner indicated by you. But I beg you as a favor, I beg you earnestly, for this 1/10th, and beg that I may receive it without delay. She bent her whole form low, and her eyes, which she raised to her father, were filled with tears. These, however, she restrained immediately. Darvid answered after a moment of silence, "Though I do not understand this whim of yours, I do not see in it anything impossible or harmful. On the contrary, I shall be glad to do something which pleases you, and tomorrow, if you like, you shall be the owner of that wretched hole. But of what use can it be to you?" Irene rose, went around the table, and bending, pressed her father's hand to her lips, and then she returned to her former place. "I thank you, father," said she. "You satisfy my most ardent desire. That wretched hole, as you call it, is just the place that Mamma desires. We shall go from here and settle down there as quickly as possible." "What?" cried Darvid, bending forward with astonishment, but soon he began to speak calmly. "I come to the conclusion that when talking with my children I should not be astonished at anything. I must be ready for any surprise." "That is natural, father, for we hardly know each other," interrupted Irene. "In reproaches of conscience," continued she, "and various other feelings of that sort, Mamma goes to exaggeration. She goes so far as to desire penance, punishment, voluntarily accepted. If time and circumstances were favorable, she would enter a cloister assuredly, and put on a hair shirt. That is an exaggeration, but what is to be done? Characters are various. Hers is of that kind. But the desire which Mamma has of withdrawing from the noise and show of the world, I understand perfectly, for first of all," she made a gesture of contempt with her hand, "all the honors, the glitter, the luxury, etc., are gates before which men with spades are standing. This means that behind them we find dust, emptiness, nothing." "Great God!" exclaimed Darvid. "What do you say, father?" inquired she. "Your age, the brilliant position in which you have lived since childhood, and this disenchantment." "Just this brilliant position, father, just because of this brilliant position, perhaps. We are not talking of me, however, but because of this, which in me you call disenchantment, I am able to understand Mamma's wish to leave society, all the more because if I were in her position, all homage, show, luxury, amusements would for me be as impossible as they are for her. This depends on character. Moreover, Mamma remembers that everything which she uses is yours, and the use of it, attended by your contempt, and the evident impossibility of ever coming to any understanding, is such a poison. So I beg you to give me Kranishna. I am your daughter, and as it seems to me, you have no thought of disinheriting me. So if I own Kranishna, Mamma will live with me and receive everything from me alone." Her voice grew weaker, and her posture less constrained. In her whole form there was an expression of suffering. Everything which she said cost her, in spite of appearances to the contrary, much effort and suffering. Darvid was silent a while, then he said, "It seems to me that I am Ali Baba, listening to the tales of Scheherazade. If I should agree to your plan, what would you do there? I do not know clearly as yet. This is Mamma's idea, her wish. She will discover more and tell me. We will examine, we shall see. Into Mamma's plans, besides quiet obscurity and modesty of life, labor enters also." She spoke in a low, wearied voice. "An idyll," laughed Darvid. "An idyll, father. I used to laugh at all idols without knowing that I had one in myself. It has saved me from many, and perhaps, dreadful things. Yes, I have an idol. I love Mamma." Then her thin lips, famous in society for their precocious, bitter irony, quivered as do those of children when preparing to cry. Darvid turned to her quickly and said with a prolonged hiss, "Why?" She raised sad eyes to him, and with a voice in which Malvina's sweet tones were heard, she answered, I am not sure that anyone could tell why he or she loves. Mama has always been kind, but I do not know. She is very pleasant, and she and I have been together always. I do not know. It may be, besides, that often I have seen her so unhappy. You see, Father, that I am sincere. I answer all your questions as far as I am able. Have regard to Mamma's scruples, I beg, and my request. Do not oppose our plans. Darvid stood in the middle of the room. He raised his head. His eyes had the flash of steel. No, said he. My daughter shall not wither away in a remote corner with my consent, because it pleases her mother to hide her. Shame there. Father, answered Irene, I must explain that your resistance will only give a more permanent, and for you, a more disagreeable form to our withdrawal. She rose, and again on her face, surrounded by the high ruff, was an expression of resolve and energy. A moment before she was full of emotion and pain. Now with the need of defense she found energy. Do you suppose, Father, that you can understand what happened, forgive, to use the general phrase, and restore your esteem and friendship to Mamma? With a form as rigid as iron, and with an evil smile on his lips, Darvid answered immediately, No. I am very sorry that I cannot play a comedy of noble-mindedness, for this is perhaps a popular comedy, but that of which you speak is forever and altogether impossible. Irene moved her head affirmatively. Then Mamma and I must withdraw, if not to Krinichna, to some remote place abroad. I know 4 European languages well. I know how to paint, and I know a few other things. Mamma possesses a real genius in several rare accomplishments, and you remember well her beautiful music. We will give lessons and do something else. I know not what. We shall find means of existence. But I beg you, Father, to believe that in no case shall we remain in this house. With pale, almost with blue lips, she laughed and added, either as inhabitants of Krinichna, or making our own living in some distant place. Which do you prefer, Father? In the last instance it depends on you. One of these 2 things we shall do most certainly. That is, properly speaking, I shall do it. I, who am Mamma's only defense. I became of age some months ago. I have finished my 21st year, and no one can hinder me from acting in this way. Whoever had seen her at that moment would have believed, perforce, that no man and no thing would have power to hinder her in carrying out her resolve. Omitting differences of age and sex, she seemed the living portrait of her father. The same cold self-confidence as in him, the same clear, penetrating glance as of steel, the same enigmatical smile on impressionable and also cold lips. As if involuntarily, and lowering her voice, she said in addition, It is our duty to put a radical stop to the family idyll out of regard also to Kara. She is innocent yet, she knows nothing, she loves all, and not only loves but worships. Life has not touched her, even with the tip of one of its angel feathers. Just imagine what would happen if, into that little volcano of lofty feeling, a spark of this knowledge were to fall. And this may happen any moment. If we do not change the condition of affairs, it will happen. She was silent, and Darvid was silent also. It might seem that he recognized only Irene's last argument as worthy of attention. The 2 voices had grown silent, one after the other. Then, somewhere in the corner of the room, was heard a rustle, not so low as before, far stronger, a low knocking rather than a rustle, and almost at the same time a servant in the open door of the antechamber called, "The horses are ready." Irene, who had turned her face toward the rustle or knocking, thought some of the countless papers in the room had dropped from the furniture, or that some book had fallen. Darvid, who also had heard the knocking or rustle, forgot it while looking at his watch. "I shall be late," said he. "You have told me things over which I must meditate. I cannot deny that they possess considerable importance. Hence, I delay, and shall beg you soon to continue this conversation. Good night, and perhaps till tomorrow." "Let it be only till tomorrow. I beg you, Father, tomorrow." Miss Mary was sitting in her pupil's bedroom, a beautiful nest which wealth had formed as a symbol of the springtime of life. From the top of the walls to the bottom, cretonne, interchanged with muslin, formed succeeding folds on which the freshest flowers of spring seemed to have been scattered. The walls, the windows, the furniture were covered with a shower of forget-me-nots and rosebuds, strewn on grounds of yellow as pale as if sunlight had penetrated them slightly. Groups of green plants at the windows looked like little groves made ready for the songs of nightingales. artistic playthings, porcelain figures, suggested a child amused with dolls yet, but a multitude of large books in gilt bindings suggested the active and methodical development of a young mind, which surely had dreams of paradise on that lace and satin bed which covered a bedstead inlaid with mother of pearl. On all the furniture, small armchairs, tables, screens, which reminded one of butterfly wings, mother of pearl rainbow tints passed into milk white. Spring tones, joyous motives, light and graceful forms filled the room of that little daughter of a millionaire with an atmosphere of childish innocence and tenderness. It was lighted from floor to ceiling and from wall to wall with a cheering light poured from the rosy tulip-shaped shade of a grand lamp. Remember to subscribe.